take off your view. Yes, so as I was saying, my name's Suzanne Leal. I'm the author of the novels The Teacher's Secret and The Deceptions, and I'm also the online host of Thursday Book Club, which was an initiative that I began when COVID hit the world, Australia included. So we meet once a week, and we meet at 8 p.m. Australian time on a Thursday for half an hour. We make it quick so that people can do something else with their evening. And once a month, it's a little bit longer, so about 45 minutes. And that's when I have a guest author to join us. If you'd like to be part of Thursday Book Club more regularly, please go to my website, which is Suzanne Leal, Leal.com, and you can subscribe and be part of it. We're a friendly group and a happy group. And I think it's been a fun endeavour for people who are our regulars. But today, of course, the reason why most of you, I think, or at least many of you are here, is to hear Graeme Friedman, who I'm delighted to have as my guest. As some of you will know, and many of you will not know, Graeme is not only an author, but also a psychologist. His novel, The Fossil Artist, was shortlisted for the Commonwealth Writers' Prize. He's also the author of the book Madiba's Boys, a non-fiction book on South African football, politics and history, with a foreword by none other than the late Nelson Mandela. Tonight, Graeme will be introducing his new novel, What the Boy Hears When the Girl Dreams. And just so you can see it all, here it is here. It's a really beautiful cover. Welcome to you, Graeme.
Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you very much for having me.
I have a very full screen here, and I think you might as well. You have many people who have come to hear.
I do see some lovely familiar faces.
I must say, it is one of the exciting things about Zoom. I'm sure a lot of people are Zoomed out, but the fact that we can bring people from across the world to be here at the same time to hear the same thing still seems something of a miracle to me. Graeme, it's a particularly special day today. Today, the 28th of October, if I'm not wrong, is the actual release date for the novel. Is that right?
That's absolutely correct, Suzanne. We were meant to have an online launch, but of course, COVID sort of spiked that. But it's in fact just this week I've heard that we're actually able to, an in-person launch. Just this week I've heard that we're being able to have that again. And so I hope some of the people who are attending today will be able to come in person as well. It'll be in about a month's time.
I think, do you want to give the actual details of that book launch?
So yes, it'll be at Glebe Books on the 27th of November at 2:30 p.m. and it'll be COVID safe.
Exciting. I think it's been a good time to launch the book. We've all been, for those of you who aren't Australian, many of us in Australia, at least in the East Coast, have been in lockdown for about 4 months. So we've just come out. So raring to go back to bookshops, raring to get back together. So a launch in November sounds like just the thing.
And one detail I forgot, Suzanne, is that we'll be talking again at the launch.
Oh, we will. So you'll get two for the price of one. You'll get us both again. It's a lovely, for those in South Africa or elsewhere or Melbourne, Glebe Books is a bit of an institution in Sydney. It's a really great book with lots of launches and events. So it's going to be a fun afternoon. I'm just going to ask everybody if they can mute, just so I don't get any feedback while I'm interviewing Graeme. We will have time for questions, and that'll be the time to unmute. So what I'd like to talk to you about, Graeme, is to focus first of all on this terrific new novel. Now, for me, What the Boy Hears When the Girl Dreams is really the story of a boy called Finn, his parents, and a woman from Malawi called Buzi, who's their homestay student. What I'd like you to do, Graeme, is to tell everybody just a little bit about Finn. If I were to see Finn now, who would he be? What would he look like?
Well, it's funny that, because, you know, of course, Finn's sort of taken up residence in our family home. And so, you know, every now and then when we're out as a family and you know, a 12-year-old blonde-haired kid is walking down the street and, you know, he's a very, you know, pretty boy, and everybody says, "Oh, is that Finn?" So that's a bit of what is sort of. I wanted to take what would initially be my character's sort of persona, which would, just an everyday Australian 12-year-old Caucasian kid. But of course, the arc of the story takes him to very different places. So he starts in that place.
And Buzzy is am I saying it Buzzy or Buzzy?
Buzzy, yeah.
Buzzy. I think there was a late South African singer called Buzzy Malongo. Is that the same name?
Yes, I think it is. Busi Makhleklela, maybe you're thinking of, who's a man, the one I'm thinking of. But anyway, it's the same name, yeah.
And tell me a bit about her. How does she come into the story, and who is she?
So, well, the story just kicks off with Finn waking up one morning to find that he has hyperacusis, super hearing, and he's on a journey to kind of make sense of this. But the first sounds, or some of the first sounds that he's hearing, are cries from the downstairs granny flat in the family home. And as he goes down to discover, this is the woman Busi, who he has never met before. She came overnight and was sort of, in a sense, sort of, his mother, who works in a hospital as a doctor, had come across this woman who had lost her accommodation and was bringing her home. And so it starts with Finn, this mystery really of, who is this woman and what do her cries mean.
What inspired the story, Graeme?
I think, well, it probably goes all the way back to my own dark days in South Africa, because of course, the book is about the coming together of my Australian and South African worlds. And so that was something I wanted to do just from the beginning, was to bring those worlds together. What inspired this particular story? I guess I wanted to tell a story from the point of view of a child. I was interested in really having a view on an adult world that comes from a different place. And so, writers do that in all sorts of ways. I'm reading a book at the moment, I don't know if you know, the Island of Missing Trees, in which the narrator is a tree. Anyway, I chose a 12-year-old boy wanting to, look at the adult world through his eyes, and having a device such as super hearing is a way of giving him access to things that usual 12-year-old kids would not hear about. So that was part of it. There's also a kind of political backdrop, of course. And my Busi character comes from Africa, and she has a backstory, and that's really the part of the journey of the novel, is the way in which Finn, because of his super hearing and because he's hearing her cry out while she's dreaming at night, starts to piece together with her what her backstory is. She's amnesic to the backstory. And so together they sort of start to discover where she, what is hidden inside her.
When you were 12 years old, you were in South Africa rather than in Australia, writing through the eyes not only of a child, but a 12-year-old Australian child, an Australian boy. Did that pose a particular challenge, or do you think that because you came slightly more as an observer, it made it easier?
Both. I knew when I was setting out for it, and I had a lot of doubt about whether I could actually pull it off just because of that. I mean, here was this 12-year-old child. As you say, it's a long time since I've been 12 years old, and an Australian kid at that. And when I first had the idea for this novel, it was quite some years ago. So we weren't here for that long. We've been here now almost 20 years, but at that time we weren't here for that long. But fortunately, I was coaching one of my son's football teams, under 13 football team, and I used that experience a lot to just listen to these boys when they spoke to each other, and get a sense of who they were, and so that was very helpful actually, in helping me just form up the character and the kind of language and thoughts and ideas that these kids have.
Because it's a particular vernacular that Finn works as well. It's almost, did you find it was almost like listening to music, trying to work out the words to use, the intonation to use?
Absolutely. And I think when we're trying to get dialogue authentic, you've really got to listen to people who match the character you're trying to portray. And so that was the big challenge. And I hope, I think so far people's feedback seems to have been that I've got it. So hopefully that'll be the general impression.
As part of the story, Finn lives in a household which is not necessarily such a happy household. His parents have a difficult marriage, and this is upsetting for the boy himself. I'm wondering if your interest in such household dynamics comes from your training as a psychologist.
Absolutely, of course, and not only that, and one of the Finn's father is a police officer who's on sick leave, he's hurt on duty, as they call it. And at the time, I suppose this is what we do as writers, isn't it? We sort of pluck fruit from the trees that we're hanging around, and so at the time I was dealing with a lot of police officers who were presenting with post-traumatic stress disorder, and so listening to their language, and not just their general language, but also, of course, the way they talk about their work, and the kind of casual technical language that police officers in Australia use would, of course, be very different to what I would have known from before. So yes, I incorporated that into thinking about Finn's parents. And of course, having worked for so many families and so many individuals over the years, knowing a lot about how family dynamics work and about the way in which people fight and the kind of language and the way of the things they fight over and so on, all of that certainly worked its way into the story.
It's interesting. We've both got a career as writers, and we both have a separate career. So you as a psychologist and me as a lawyer, and particularly I run hearings at the moment. My question for you is, what's the line between using as fruit from the tree people we meet, situations we come up against in our professional careers? Where's the line between using that as inspiration and becoming too close?
Well, of course, for both of us, there'd be very, very important ethical considerations about not using material that's told to us confidentially. So, the character of Finn's father is nobody that I worked with. He's some sort of amalgamation, and then, of course, lots of my own imagination thrown into that. So, there might be phrases, the way the police officers talk about, for example, when a police officer is on stress leave, they say that their guns, which are usually Glock pistols, are double locked, for example. So, a phrase like that, which, would be common to all police officers. None of it would be identifying in any way any particular person that I would have worked with. And that is something one has to obviously be very, very careful about.
I personally find it a privilege to be able to come into people's lives at a time when things are difficult. If they find themselves in front of a tribunal, it's often difficult. And I think from your perspectives, if people have made the decision to come and see a psychologist, that's often a difficult decision. Do you find that this really sparks your interest in what makes people tick that you can then put into your writing?
It's such a privilege, really, to work in these kind of professions where we're in a position to listen to people's stories and to listen to them in such a, you know, what is so often such an open, vulnerable, intimate way. It's an enormous privilege. And for me, that's, yes, absolutely. It's a very fascinating part of my work as a psychologist, but it's this massive overlap, isn't it, with being a writer, because, you know, while when we're writing our own stories, but we're in the world of stories. So whether you're listening to it or you're creating your own stories, it's all story. And for me, that's part of the big part of the beauty of both of my areas of work.
Sometimes to write a novel takes a long time. I think you're quicker than me, but it does take a long time. It takes a lot of work. And for me, there needs to be the nub of an itch or the nub of a problem that will propel me through the many hours it needs to finish it. In What the Boy Hears When the Girl Dreams, was there a problem you set out to solve? Was there an issue you set out to explore that propelled you through the novel?
I think there are probably a few issues, and I do think that, well, particularly fiction writing is you know, often very autobiographical, even though we disguise it tremendously. If we're going to move our readers, then we're going to be putting you know, something of ourselves in it in a very deeply embedded way. And so, yes, you know, Finn's relationship with his father is something very much part of my own experience, and something, you know, I've really been working on and working through my whole life is you know, my relationship with my own father. So there'd be that, you know, that would really interest me in terms of that relationship. But the political angle as well, the issue around the way in which we're all so interconnected. I mean, growing up in South Africa and being involved in the civil conflict in South Africa really opened my eyes to the way in which ordinary people's lives can be so damaged and shattered by some decision that some, usually, you know, old white guy makes in Washington or Canberra or some capital somewhere else. And that's what happened, of course, in Africa and Southern Africa with so many conflicts, was that there were proxy wars going on between the Soviet Union and the Western allies being fought on African soil. And so part of that, you know, which is, you know, had my blood boiling often for many years, is something that I've you know, worked into this novel as well.
What you've also worked into the novel is dream sequences. So because Finn has super hearing, he can hear enough into the granny flat where Buzzy is sleeping. He can hear the words that she mutters or that she shouts out in the middle of the night. Why were dreams so important to this novel?
Well, dreams are just so important, full stop. To start off with, as a psychologist, I work a lot with dreams. You know, as Freud said, they have the royal road to the unconscious. But more than that, for the purpose of the novel, they provided me, I guess, with a device in which Finn could, you know, he takes on this task of sort of being Buzzy's dream interpreter, well, partly interpreter, but partly sort of translator. So she's dreaming and she's talking in her sleep. And initially she's talking in Chichewa, which is, you know, the sort of broadly spoken language in Malawi. So he doesn't quite understand, but he's picking up threads here and there, and together they sort of begin to slowly work out what these dreams are about. So it provides a window, and I guess a way of slowly, you know, building up the story, the backstory, her backstory.
what I find interesting is your use of setting. In my last two novels, I've shied away from many real settings, at least within Australia, and I've fictionalized towns and places. Not you. You are very, very precise in your new novel, in what the boy hears when the girl dreams. And you set it, in fact, in Maroubra, which is a place that's dear to you and close to you. Why did you decide to be so specific, and why did you decide to use a real place in a fictional world?
I wanted to ground it, and there's a lot of Maroubra history in the book, as you know, and people who read it will see and be interested in it. Maroubra is a fascinating place. I don't want to say too much, because I think, you know, some of it sort of threads its way into the book, and so I don't want to give away too many spoilers, but it's such a fascinating suburb, and with an incredible history, and one that's been phenomenally colorful. You know, lots of sort of, you know, nefarious activity going on of one sort or another. But also, of course, this is where the Speedway was located. So people who aren't familiar with Maroubra or the history, wouldn't know about this, but there was, in the 1920s and 1930s, a speedway. It used to be the sort of edge of town, of Sydney town, and there was the speedway in which drivers would hurtle around this oval concrete track in their motorbikes and on their motorbikes and their motor cars, and became known as the killer track, because various people just drove off the edge and killed themselves. So that, I think, had me thinking, I'm going to really use this suburb.
And then, by contrast, you bring a woman in who's from Africa, as you're from Africa, but not from your Africa, not from South Africa. She, in fact, is from Malawi. Now, of all the countries that you could have chosen, why is Buzi from Malawi?
That's entirely I don't know fortuitous, I suppose. We have a friend from Malawi. She may even be on the call. I can't see everybody who's here, but she, we were just, this was before I'd even sort of really gotten into writing the book, but we'd be chatting about, her experience growing up in Malawi. I should say that my character Busi is not this friend of ours at all, but her stories of living in a village which is similar to where I've put Busi were fascinating, and it fitted what I wanted to do with the character and with the backstory that I wanted to emerge. So I didn't want to have that person be South African. I sort of felt like I wanted to try something else, something different. And so we was just very lucky that this friend of ours was around.
You're South African, but you've lived in Australia for 20 years. When you write, do you think, as an Australian, as a South African, as neither, or as both?
It's a funny thing, because of course that was my concern at the beginning of writing this book, as that, was I going to be able to write about Australian characters? And I thought, well, it's a bit like, you get this sort of pipe in this home that you're renovating, and it's sort of sticking in the middle of nowhere, and you want to disguise it. Well, instead of disguising it, you painted some beautiful color or something. So, how do you make a virtue out of what might otherwise be a difficulty? And the way of making a virtue, I think, for me, was about thinking about how to be both inside and outside at the same time. Mm. So, as I was more and more becoming settled, in Australia, and I guess parts of myself becoming more and more Australian. Even I'm aware my accent has even changed over the years. But at the same time, I'm still South African, and so both inside and outside, and that fitted the theme of the book as well. Because so much of it is about belonging and seeing things differently from the outside, which is what happens with Finn as he goes along because of his condition, as it were. He can begin to see and hear things that he didn't when he was embedded in who he used to be.
I think what that is in part is being an observer, being to some extent both a participant and an observer. For those who don't know me, my recent book is about the Holocaust, and I'm not Jewish, and nor do I have Jewish family members. What I did have was a very close friend who was so close that he told me his story. And I think sometimes, whilst I've grappled with it, whether that was the story for me to tell, I think it was, what I do think is that I came slightly as an observer. So I came far enough in to be very close and trusted, but far enough out to be the observer that the writer often needs to be. Would you describe yourself in similar terms as something of an observer, despite being within the crowd?
Oh, absolutely. You've just described it beautifully, and that's exactly what we have to do, isn't it? We have to be able to step back and look at what we're seeing. And from your writing, I'm sure you'd have similar experiences that you're often stepping back and visualizing something, as if you're watching a movie, only it's your own sort of projections onto some screen or other. And so you're in the observer's position all the time. And you're in that anyway, because, as you go about, sitting on the bus going to work, or you're at the beach or whatever, you're listening and looking and picking up, scraps of conversation, or the way somebody moves, or the way a bird flies past, or whatever it might be, right? Those are all things that I think, even for me, without even being conscious of, they sort of, some part of me is clocking all of that.
I note that we've come to almost 8:30. Now, generally I go over about 10, 15 minutes when I've got a guest, so that we can have a decent conversation, and also so Graeme can answer your questions. So look, if you have questions, I'm just wondering if you might start popping them into the chat box now. And as they come through, I'll ask Graeme. Graeme, we've been in a COVID world for quite a long time now, and I'm just wondering how that has affected you both as a writer and as a psychologist.
Well, as a psychologist, because we're, especially, in the months of lockdown, it's meant doing therapy on Zoom, which has been an interesting experience, and by and large worked quite well. But clearly, if anybody's ever tried to get into a psychologist these days, there's a lot of stress out there, and people are really struggling, and most of my colleagues are very, very busy and full. So I guess there's a sense of sort of the burden that people are feeling out there. But for myself, I feel I've sort of been quite fortunate in the sense of being able to carry on my work. And in fact, because, I'm not going out much and not doing much else, I've gotten a lot more writing done. So it's been, from a writing perspective, it's been a very productive time.
And are you someone that thinks in your future work that the lockdown will feature in it, or are you someone who will bypass the whole mess of it?
I think I'll bypass it. It feels like there's going to be a lot of people talking about it, and I'm not sure I've got anything to add. I might just bypass it, but who knows? If it fits a character, it's one uses it, don't we?
It's interesting. I've been asking that question to many of the people that I've interviewed, and always there are extremely vehement answers. It's not an I don't know. It's either yes, I will have to confront it, or no, I will not. And generally it's no, I will not. So I'm looking forward to a number of books set in 2019 or perhaps in a fiction, in a fantasy world. We've got some questions coming through. This is from Barbie Robinson. And this is her question. Could your female character have come from anywhere, or is the African nationality and culture significant and essential?
Yes, thanks, Barbie. The African character is very essential. I guess not only because of my own desire to, bring my old world and my new world together, but because of the story itself. And so I don't want to say too much more about that because I don't want to spoil it, but her backstory has to do with things that happened particularly in Africa. And I suppose, those themes I could have transplanted elsewhere, because of course there've been all sorts of areas in the world in which some of the things have happened. So I suppose the answer to the question is yes and no. I could have located my character elsewhere as well.
What I'm interested in, Graeme, is your spread of writing experience and capacity. So you write not only novels, but non-fiction work and also short stories. What do you prefer? If you could only do one thing, what would you prefer?
I think probably fiction is my favorite, so long form novel. Actually, I haven't written a short story for years, but I think generally what's happened for me is that I've written some fiction and then switched to non-fiction and then back to fiction, and that's been a lovely thing to do. There are different forms, although of course there's a massive overlap in terms of technique and so on. Yeah, some of the fiction has just happened because it's been one or two things have been commissioned, and so when a job like that comes along and it's a fascinating, interesting thing to do, then of course I haven't been able to turn it down. Yeah, probably fiction's my first love.
We have another question from Elizabeth Walton, and her question is, how did you decide to have the superpower of extra special hearing? Such a fascinating idea.
Oh, that's a great question, because it's again one of those just fortuitous things. I was looking for something, to give my boy character. And, I think it was around the time that The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime had come out a couple of years before. And I didn't want to go down that road of, somebody who's a little bit on the spectrum or something like that. And I was just driving to work one day and I was listening to the health report. And it was a report on a medical condition in which leads to super hearing. And that was it. That was all I needed.
I mean, it's perfect, isn't it? Because in terms of a writer, it's always, you need to be hearing something you're not supposed to be hearing, or seeing something you're not supposed to be seeing. And it's difficult to make that work often, because often you just can't be in that position. So you must have just thought, eureka, did you?
Oh, it was just, I'm surprised I didn't have an accident in my car, because it was like, wow, this is fantastic. This is what this just fell into my lap. And it was just, it just luck, really. I just happened to be driving to work at that time and listening to Radio National. It was just brilliant.
I think Elizabeth Gilbert would say, the author would say, it's not luck, but that was the muse finding you. Dina Davis has a question for you, and this is her question. What's your opinion of using dreams in fiction?
Well, I'd have to say, given that I have used them, go for it. At the same time, I think that one does have to be a bit careful not to overburden dream sequences. My own sense is that and I've tried to do this in the book, in terms of the actual dream sequences, to just really have them in snippets. although something else happens later on in the story. But anyway, it's about having a balance, really.
Thank you. Just before we've turned to the final question, I've got an odd question for you, but just run with me. Graeme, can you give me a number between 1 and 28, please?
19.
19. Okay. Give me a moment. Now, while I'm explaining that to you, my last question for you is, what's next? This is finished. Lockdown has eased in Australia. What's on the writing calendar for you next?
Well, I'm about 2/3 the way through a memoir, which is a form I haven't tried before, which is based on the political work that I did in South Africa back in the anti-apartheid days. So that'll take another year or so probably to finish.
That's fascinating. Has that been a difficult thing to write, given that it is memoir?
It's been phenomenally difficult, and I put it off for about 25 or 30 years. And in fact, so difficult that I actually ended up going and enrolling in a PhD in order to get it done. And really needed somebody to hold my hand through the process, because it has so much to do with very, very traumatic incidences in which I was involved in. And it's a very painful, difficult time, which I hope I'm writing in a way which will be accessible and a worthy read.
Has it taken this long to be able to get yourself to the seat to write something as personal as that?
Yes. I could never have tried to do this before. I actually tried to write up a particular trial that I've based this on years ago in a fictional form, and it didn't work very well. It was an incident, a sort of an example of just trying to do something too soon, really. I needed time to go by before I could really authentically, truthfully, examine my own role in all of, what had happened back then. I mean, I don't want to sound mysterious, but I mean, basically I was involved in helping freedom fighters or people who at that time would have been called terrorists by the South African state, in helping them in their political trials. And so, it involves lots of really soul searching around my own sort of support of political violence at the time, and a difficult thing to interrogate.
I'm looking forward to reading that. It sounds like a fascinating work. Number 19, the number you've chosen, belongs on this occasion, according to my counting, to Karen Daniel, who is the winner of our makeshift raffle. So, Karen, since you're out there, if you could email me with your address, and the prize will be on its way. My email is just my name, which is suzanne@suzanneleal.com, and otherwise you can find it online. So Graeme, thank you. I'm always delighted to talk to you. I'm so pleased and proud of the book that you've written, and I hope it flies in the world, and I'm sure that everybody who reads it will be as impressed and as moved by it as I was. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. Thank you, everybody, for taking part.
Thank you, everybody. And I'd love to see you again next week, again, 8 o'clock Thursdays. And one more time, congratulations to my guest, Graeme Friedman. Happy publication day. Goodbye.